these are very important to understand because every person that loses a loved one, they go through these 5 stages. They're not sequential. So they're not necessarily in order. You may not experience them one after the next. It's not A, B, C, D. They just happen to you. You experience them. And it's important to understand them so that when you're going through the grieving process and certain things happen to you, you aren't alarmed by it and you aren't surprised by it. And you can recognize and identify in that moment, this is me grieving. And that's why I feel this way. That's why I'm experiencing this. And it just helps you to identify and work through that process. So let's talk about these five stages. The first stage is denial. Now, almost everybody is familiar with the first stage of grief, and a lot of times denial has a negative connotation to it, and people feel negatively towards this whole concept of denial, but it's actually part of the grief process. It's not good or bad. It's just part of the process. It's part of the way that God made us and helps us to approach and deal with our grieving process, our grief. Our very first reaction to losing our loved one or to losing anything in life that causes us grief is to deny it. It's a coping mechanism that God gave us to protect ourselves from the loss, the reality of the loss. So the first thing is we deny it. Now, all of the stages I'm going to talk about, they're all useful, they're all important. Again, they are innately part of who we are. It's part of what God made us to be. So we experience these things because this is the way that God gave us to cope with grief and loss. So denial is fine. The problem with denial is if you get stuck in denial. So if you get stuck in denial, all of a sudden it can turn into what's known as pathological grief. And this is an unhealthy focus, and it manifests itself in many different ways. There are extremes. When you talk about denial, there are extremes within denial. So for instance, one extreme of denial is the person continues to talk to their loved one every day. And like we talked about earlier, maybe they put their arms around the urn and they cry and have a conversation with that person. At the beginning, when you first have lost your loved one, some of that stuff's normal. So you may have a conversation where you feel like you're talking to them, or maybe you see birds do something and you feel like it's a symbolic message for them. That stuff is kind of normal. The problem is 6 months from now or a year from now, that's not as helpful. And if you start to experience these things on a regular basis and you're constantly in denial about the fact that they're gone and they're somehow communicating with you, this is problematic because your loved one has passed on. And if you have a Christian foundation, if you believe in God and you believe in heaven, if you believe in those things, you don't want that person to be here anyways. Because the Bible says that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So the Christian belief is that we believe our loved ones die and then they go to be in paradise with God and with Christ. If they were here with us, something went terribly wrong. And we don't want that. And so, but this is, when you're experiencing grief and loss, this happens. And so that's one extreme. Another extreme would be when the denial results in ultra busyness. Okay, and this is where maybe somebody says, well, I'm just going to make sure that I'm always going. Or I'm always doing, because I'm not going to think about this. And so what the person does is they immerse themselves in all kinds of activities. They never give themselves an opportunity to think through the loss. Of course, the problem with this is that eventually they're going to have to face it. It's inevitable. It's going to happen, and when they do face it, because they've tried to avoid it for so long, it's going to hit them that much harder. It's going to be very, very ugly. Another example of this would be to try to completely remove the memory of the person. And this one, a lot of people that would hear this might think, well, I would never do that. But people do. Like, for instance, they sell their house. They marry somebody else, or they get a new boyfriend or a girlfriend right away. They sell all that person's possessions. They give that person's clothing and their aftershave and all that stuff away within a short period of time after the loss. This is all unhealthy, and these are all different signs of denial. And so we don't want to go over here. There's some denial that's okay, but these are pretty extreme examples of it. And so we want to avoid the extremes. It's okay, if you want to, every once in a while, you talk to your loved one or something like that, that's okay. Or if sometimes people will feel that person's presence in the room. That's not your fault. Okay, you feel like they're in the room with you. That's okay. It's kind of a problem a year from now, though. Because a year later, you really shouldn't be experiencing that anymore. Like we said, we don't want them to be here. We want them to be with God in heaven. Okay? So the second stage of grief is sadness. And this is pretty self-explanatory. We all understand what it's like to be sad. We know what it means to be sad. We know what it means to feel like we're down in the dumps. And so being sad is part of the grief process. We all experience this. We cry, we feel a little bit down. And this is normal and it's part of the process. In fact, I'm more alarmed about someone who never experiences any emotion. That a person that's completely stoic is experiencing a type of denial that is not natural and not healthy. Okay, so sadness is an important part of the grief process. The problem with sadness is if you get stuck in this stage of grief, sadness becomes depression. We all know that depression is dangerous. People do lots of self-destructive things when they're depressed. And that can be substance abuse. It could be getting involved in relationships that are inappropriate, promiscuity. It could be overeating, all kinds of obsessive compulsive behaviors to try to quell this feeling and to get rid of this emptiness and this depression that exists. But we don't want to while we want to experience the sadness and give ourselves opportunities to experience the fact that we're sad and that we're grieving, we do not want it to become an all-consuming experience. And so if our sadness becomes too much and we get stuck in the stage of grief, it becomes depression. Now, I am not a big advocate for the use of drugs to treat depression.
Me neither.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm not is because what drugs do is they deal with the symptom and they don't really deal with the problem. It's probably the biggest issue in the medical industry nowadays, is people are too medicated. Having said that, sometimes a person needs a bridge to get from point A to point B. And so, if you can work through your grief without using medication to help you through it, that's better, because you're going to deal with your feelings and you're going to work through it quicker. And of course, the problem is if you use the medication, it can suppress how you feel, and you don't work through those things, and so it may take you longer. You may not even realize how upset you are and how much grief there is inside of you if you begin to take antidepressant medication or mood stabilizers or whatever it is your doctor prescribes you. Having said that, I'm not anti the use of medications. Some people need it, and if you need it, then you need to go talk to your doctor and you need to get a prescription for whatever it is he thinks that you need, so that you can work through this. And when you talk to your doctor, if you have a good doctor, he should tell you this is temporary. We only want to do this for a set period of time. But if he doesn't do that, or she doesn't do that, then you need to explain to them, I'm just doing this to get through this time. I would like to go off of this at a certain point. And then your doctor can work with you on that. Okay? So this is the second stage of grief. The third stage of grief is anger. And it's interesting to me, a lot of people, when you mention this stage of grief, they deny that there's anger. Some people are very open about it. There are certain people that will just be like, oh, heck yeah, I'm angry about this and that and the other thing. But a lot of people will deny it. When you start to explore and talk to them a little bit more, what you discover is there is anger there. It's just oftentimes they don't realize that the source of their anger is their grief. So for instance, for most people, when they're going through grief, the anger is directly pointed at or associated with doctors, nurses, chaplains, social workers, anybody that's in the healthcare industry. And what will happen is there will be some kind of event that took place during the death process. And there was some injustice or something that happened. And it may have been serious, it may have been significant, but it will be completely magnified and blown out of proportion, even if the anger is justified. It'll be completely magnified to a place that it never should go, because when you're grieving, you hurt. And when you hurt for long periods of time and you cannot remedy the hurt, what happens? You get angry. Anyone that's ever worked with a dying person that's going through pain, or a person that's ever done pain management and has been with someone that is in intense amounts of pain, those people tend to be short, snippy, and they have tempers, and they get angry and they can blow their stack at any moment. Why? Because pain that is not treated and not managed results in anger. The same thing is true with our emotions. And so if you are hurting for long periods of time and it doesn't get better, eventually you're going to get angry. Now, the anger in dysfunctional families, the anger is oftentimes pointed at family members. And so you'll see this, if you lose a loved one or someone becomes terminally ill, you'll see family members turn on each other and do all kinds of crazy things that you never thought you would ever see in your home and with your loved ones and your friends. And it happens. It's part of the grief process. But when you see it, it's good for you to be able to identify and say, wait a minute. This is a manifestation of grief. People are grieving, and that's why this person is angry, and that's why this person over here is sad, and that's why this person over here is talking to themselves. And you see all these things happening, and when you look at it from that perspective, you can go, wait a minute. They're all different, they have different personalities, and they're all grieving in their own way. Now, anger is usually not a problem, but there are a couple of issues that can arise from anger. One issue is, again, self-destructive behavior. We already talked about that with depression. In this case, the person is trying to escape from their depression. In this case, the person's acting out because they're hurting, okay? And so that can manifest itself in lots of different ways, lots of self-destructive behaviors. We talked about some of them already: overeating, using drugs, alcohol. One way could be to say, I'm mad at God. Which is okay for a short period of time. God can handle your anger, but eventually, you need to get to the place where you can say, this isn't God's fault. People die, things happen. And so, anger at its extreme would result in self-destructive behavior up into suicide, or murder. Now, I've never had anybody commit murder that I was working with, but I have had people commit suicide. And I have to tell you, it is the most heartbreaking thing for me personally, because I couldn't help that person the way that I wanted to. And she was angry and she was depressed. She was both. And eventually she took her life because she couldn't make the pain go away. And eventually she just decided she would go away. And she committed the most self-destructive act possible. And she took her life. And sad to get the phone call from her mother. Have her mother read the letter to me. So anyways, anger can be a problem. We don't want to get stuck here. But we don't want to say we can't feel angry. I want to make it clear. We need to go through all of these. So don't say, I can't be angry at God. You can be angry at God. Just don't be angry at God 2 years from now. Eventually you need to work through these things. All right, number 4, fourth stage of grief is guilt. Now, these last 2 stages are different than all the rest. when you talk about guilt, the problem with guilt is most of the time, most of the guilt that people experience is false. So I would say probably 95% of the time when people are experiencing guilt as they're going through the stages of grief, they feel bad for things that they had no control over. They'll say, I wish I had been there when the person died. Well, it's not your fault. You didn't know they were going to die the minute that you walked out of the room. Mm-hmm. Or, they'll be upset because they felt like they should have spent more time with them before they passed away. Well, you know what? We all have lives to lead. That's not a realistic thing to put upon yourself. Sometimes guilt's genuine. Sometimes, maybe you did something in your marriage you shouldn't have done that you feel bad about. Maybe there was some kind of abuse in the relationship. Maybe you did something that you regret doing. And those are normal, but here's the other thing you have to understand even about normal guilt. You can't change anything. You can't change any of it. And so to beat yourself up over anything doesn't make any sense because you can't change it. And the odds are that if your loved one were able to come back and have a conversation with you, they would look at you and they would say, I love you and I forgive you and everything is okay. Which brings to mind a very important thing. If you're in a situation where you haven't lost your loved one and someone's going through the death process, it's very important for three things to happen. Every person that's passing away and every person that is saying goodbye to that person needs to do three things. They need to say, I love you, I forgive you, and goodbye. Mm-hmm. Those three things are absolutely essential. So when we talk about guilt, this is a normal part of the grief process. If you are having issues with guilt, it's important sometimes that we fact check guilt. Because like I said, usually guilt is a liar. It's usually fake. It's false guilt. If it's real guilt, then you're going to need to work through it and figure out a way to forgive yourself. But you can even fact check real guilt by reminding yourself, I can't change it. There's nothing I could do. They're gone. They love me. If they were here, they would tell me to move on and not to beat myself up over these things. So guilt is a nasty one to get stuck in because if you get stuck with guilt, guess where you end up?
Sadness.
You end up here. You end up depressed. So we want to avoid that. We don't want to do that because depression is very bad. Or you could end up angry at yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what guilt is. You feel bad. If you can't get rid of it long enough, you can become angry with yourself and get involved in self-destructive behaviors. All right, finally that brings us to the fifth stage of grief. The fifth stage of grief is acceptance. And I don't have a lot to say about this one. Because when you've gotten to the place where you accept the loss, you are in a pretty good place. The only thing I would say is this. As you're going through the grief process, you may be here one day and then you're here the next day. Because again, it's part of the 5 stages and they're not sequential. And you're going to experience them in a random fashion. So one minute you may be feeling acceptance and the next day you're angry and the next moment you're guilty and the next moment you're sad and the next minute you're talking to them and you're in denial. So just be aware that, these are the dynamics. Now there are other stages. There are other models for the stages of grief. There's a 7-stage model. There's a 9-stage model. When you go read through those, if you're going through the stages of grief, you'll read through some of the things that are there and you'll be like, I've never experienced that. That's because maybe you haven't. Some people experience things like bargaining, which is one of the stages of the 7-stage model. But not everybody experiences that. And so these 5 stages are universal. Everybody experiences all 5 of these. I like to keep it simple because it's easy to remember these 5, especially if you list them in this order and you try to remember them in this particular order. But these are the 5 stages of grief. And as you work through your grief and you see these things, just recognize, yes,